Now let us imagine that you are a country that wants nuclear weapons and you want to test them. Where are you going to do it? I mean, you're clearly not going to set off an atom bomb as a test in the middle of a major city or some fertile farmland. So normally these countries have picked maybe remote islands. The USA, France and the UK all use them. Desert regions, USA, USSR, China, France and the UK all use those. Or in the case of the USSR, polar regions. And the claim was always that these tests were perfectly safe, they were happening in uninhabited areas and nobody was harmed. But like so many things about nuclear weapons, this was largely a lie. These regions were often not inhabited by the many people, but they were inhabited by indigenous people of various nationalities who were often removed, dispossessed from their homes and often harmed. For example, here is the Castle Bravo test. This was the largest test of a thermonuclear warhead done by the USA in 1954. This was done at a Pacific island. The Pacific island had been inhabited, but the locals were removed. They had no choice in the matter. They were told they had to go. And given what happened to the island, that's probably a good idea for them. But however, neighbouring islands were left inhabited. And that was bad. The tests were only supposed to be conducted when the wind blew the radioactive fallout away from the neighbouring inhabited islands. But they'd set up the test, it was ready to go, and then the wind changed. I can understand the point of view of the people running this test. They've just spent a huge amount of money, they've got ships in position, they've got aircraft in position, there are hundreds of people waiting for it. They decided to go ahead anyway, even though it wasn't quite right, which meant the radioactivity wasn't blowing in a safe direction. And this particular explosion turned out to be much more violent than expected due to a nuclear reaction that no one had understood. Net result was that huge amounts of coral was ground up into small dust, which was blown up and then fell down as a cloud of what seemed like grey ash, highly radioactive grey ash, downwind. So here is where Bikini Atoll, where the explosion was set off, ground zero here, and you can see the cloud of fallout, and the Rongelap Atoll and Rongerik Atolls, both of which were inhabited, which were about 100 kilometers away, were doused with a pretty heavy dose of radiation. Some people at the Rongelap Atoll, these are Pacific Islander indigenous people, were exposed to up to 3 sieverts of radiation. Not 3 millisieverts, 3 sieverts, and that's getting close to a lethal dose. When it was realised what had happened, they were evacuated 48 hours later, but it was too late. Children had been out there playing, watching this ash that was falling from the sky, and many got extremely high radiation doses. Also exposed was the crew of a Japanese fishing ship. They saw the sky light up. Of course, the military test was secret. They didn't know anything about it. There was an exclusion zone. No ships were in the zone, but they were outside the zone. Because the explosion was bigger than expected and the wind wasn't what was hoped for, they were again heavily exposed. Clouds of ash fell on them. Make things worse, they collected some of this ash because they weren't sure what it was and hung it up next to where they sleep, which gave them an even higher radiation dose. So both for the islanders and for the people on the fishing boat, there were immediate effects. Their hair was falling out, weeping sores in their bodies. One fisherman died from the immediate effects. Most of them recovered. But the islanders then, after a few years, were moved back. Oh no, it's safe now. But it wasn't safe. A lot of the radioactive fallout had been incorporated into the food chain, and some of the traditional foods they eaten were now contaminated. And so many showed long-term cancer and birth defects. Even worse, a lot of them were taken away and told they were being given medical help, but in fact they were being used as experimental subjects. The military doctors thought this is a great chance to see how bad radiation sickness is. But they were never asked, do you want to be a test subject? They were just experimented upon without being asked, which is pretty immoral. So this is just one example out of many cases where there was a secret military test, the military didn't follow their own safety protocol, and people had been dispossessed, and indigenous people very often removed from their lands ahead of it, and were often dosed with radiation afterwards. And I've given an example of the US test, but in fact other countries probably did more and worse. only we don't know so much about it. The USSR, the Soviet Union, Russia as it was, did many of their tests in Kazakhstan, and fallout landed in inhabited regions. This was all very secret at the time, but since Kazakhstan became an independent country, it's been possible to research this a little bit. This is many years after the tests, but it looks like probably tens of thousands of people died from low-level radiation, much worse than any other nuclear accident. In the case of China, things are more secret still. They did most of their tests at the Lupnor location in Xinjiang province, and what happened then and what happened afterwards again is totally secret and no one can research it. However, based on studies of how much radioactivity arrived outside the borders and studies of the prevailing wind at the time, it's clear that fallout landed on populated areas of Xinjiang province and that probably a lot of people were exposed to high amounts of radiation. And it's very hard to know what happened because it's all secret and no one can investigate this, and the Chinese government denies that any of this happened. But some estimates are that actually hundreds of thousands of people died, and there are some areas of Xinjiang where to this day cancer rates and birth defects are very common because of this. But again, we don't know this. The government is not admitting to it. More recently, we have French nuclear testing. The French continued testing after the other test ban treaties, mostly in the South Pacific islands of French Polynesia, Polynésie Française. Here's one of their tests. And this is a very similar story. They were supposed to be testing when the wind would blow the radiation away from any inhabited areas. So here's Mururoa, where the explosion took place. But this is where the cloud of radiation actually went. And you see it went right over Tahiti and Moorea, the inhabited islands of French Polynesia. Now this was nothing like as bad as the American tests. The exposure was actually only about 1 millisievert over these islands. Luckily they were far enough away that by the time the radiation got there it had been pretty diffused and a lot of the isotopes had, the half-lives had passed, so it was less radioactive. And 1 millisievert is actually less than the background radiation or comparable to it. But nonetheless that may give a small chance of increasing cancer over there, and again it shouldn't have happened. They decided to go ahead with the test even though the wind wasn't in the correct direction.